Well, I'm glad that you've chosen tonight to be here. I hope that as we come to every Sunday night, you and I will be glad that we have the opportunity, not just to gather together, but another opportunity for every one of us to spend time in worship. You know, we should really cherish every moment in worship, shouldn't we? I believe it's a moment that the brethren can be together, as we've talked about recently, but it's a moment that we can really ignore the world. I think these are some of the moments where we can ignore what's going on. Not only in our lives, it seems to melt away, but we can ignore what's going on in the world for just a moment and kind of be refreshed so we can face the week, face the days that we're looking at inside of our time. I'm also glad you're here tonight because you're not here at 6 p.m., which means I won't talk about you when you walk in late. I told Larry Thomason if he walked in late, I was going to talk about him, and he showed me he was here. So we're not going to do that tonight, but I still talked about him. But I'm glad you're here tonight, even with that time change, and you're not late. I want you to go with me to Genesis chapter 28 and be prepared to look at one passage from Genesis chapter 27 and then to spend the rest of our evening together in Genesis 28 and inside of Genesis 29, because what we want to do is we want to look at a man on the run. And he's probably not a man of which you have thought about very often as being on the run, but when he leaves his mother and father, it's because his brother wants to kill him. He had just tricked his father into the birthright. He had just made himself look like his brother in the appearance of his physical body, at least that which could be felt because his father's eyes were dim. And now his mother is telling his father it's time to send him away to go get him a wife. And that's really where we pick up with this man that's on the run as we're looking at tonight. And what I want us to do is really 5 things, and I'm hoping they'll go rather quickly. Number 1, I want to look at Jacob's far journey. And let's see what prodded the journey, and let's see what he does as he begins and starts to take his journey. Number 2, I want to look at Jacob's tall dream. In the midst of this journey, as he's there in a resting place, he's going to have a dream. And this isn't a dream like you and I have, but this is something of which come from the Lord, and it explains to him that everything that's been handed down, everything that's been promised is going to continue through you, and that he has to be exactly who he needs to be. And then tonight, let's look at a love story. It's not often in a sermon we look at a love story, but we're going to see a scene where a man meets a woman and he loves her. Matter of fact, the text is going to indicate that as he gazed at her, he loved her. Let's look at Jacob's love story. And then let's look at Jacob's long labors. A 7-year stint turns into a 14-year journey, and he's going to blame somebody else in the middle of it. It's going to be interesting as we see. And then for you and I, what I want us to do is look at some lessons learned and things of which we can understand that will help us as we live and as we think about Jacob, who was really a man who was on the run as we see him tonight. So let's look at this journey, and we see Jacob in Genesis chapter 27, and I want you to read with me verse 41. Genesis 27, verse 41, this is a passage about his brother. The beginning of this far journey begins with a family feud that begins between 2 brothers. Verse 41, and Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. This is really a difficult moment to start in, isn't it? A family has been torn apart by preference. A family has been torn apart by a brother who really tricked and lied to his father. If you go back and read Genesis 27, he says, I am Esau. But it was Jacob who said that. He was not who he said he was. He disguised his hands to be in the like appearance of his brothers. You have another brother, as this tale begins, who says within himself, and the verse says here in verse 41, he said within his heart, in other words, he thought it among himself that his father's about to die. And after that has taken place, I will kill my brother. That's really a tragedy as it begins, isn't it? of a family of which has been torn apart, and a family of which, as we continue to see this, is going to continue to be torn apart by the things of which are happening inside of life. We roll over into Genesis 28, and we see this family. We see them to continue. It's Isaac who is called Jacob in verse 1, and it's time to send him away. If you look at the latter part of chapter 27, you will see Rebekah is pleading with Isaac to send him away. She's not all clear about why she's sending him away, but it seems to be that she's wanting him to be sent away because her other son wanted to kill her other son of whom she loved. And here the beginning starts. And Isaac charges him and said unto him, verse 1, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go, and he tells him where to go and tells him who he needs to go. And he says, Take a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother. You know, it's interesting to me that he's being sent away. He knows what he has done at home. Isaac now in verses 1 and 2 has listened to Rebekah, his mother, or at least Jacob's mother. And Isaac has given some instructions in verses 1 and 2 and continues in verses 3 and 4. Listen to what he says in verses 3 and 4. The best advice I believe could be given. And God Almighty bless thee and make thee fruitful and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham. You see, Isaac instructs Jacob. In verse 5, Jacob listens and leaves. It's verse 5. And Isaac sent away Jacob, and he goes to where he's told, to who he was told, which was Jacob and Esau's mother's brother. It's interesting to me that this far journey begins with advice. I think every journey should begin with advice, shouldn't it? This is where you need to go. This is who you need to meet. This is what you need to do. But I believe this is the best advice Jacob's ever going to get, verses 3 and 4. You know what the verse or the particular advice is in verses 3 and 4? You stay with God. Now, as we go through this lesson, remember, in chapter 27, he tries to go against the grain of things and succeeds. In chapter 28 and 29, you're going to see him in chapter 28 taking his travel, and you're going to see his brother going against what his father has just told him for himself. But then you're going to see him in chapter 29 doing some of the same things. So keep it in mind what Isaac has told Jacob as Jacob begins on his journey of which is going to lead him to this dream. That's where we begin. We really move over into verse 10 of chapter 28. Inside of the previous verses, Esau goes after a wife. He goes against the advice that his father had just given his brother and marries someone outside of this realm anyways. But Jacob is on his journey, as you pick up in verse 10. And Jacob went out from where he was in Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried all night because the sun was set. You know, in verse 10 and verse 11, we learn a few things. As Jacob begins his travels and as we see him on his travels, boy, travel really has changed, hasn't it? We can travel all night if we need to, can't we? We can travel all day if we need to, can't we? But the sun is set, verse 11, and it was time for travel to cease. So read the rest of the verse with me for just a moment. The sun is set, he took the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. What kind of pillow do you have? That's probably an odd question to be asked while you're looking at a Bible text, isn't it? What kind of pillow do you have? Well, some have memory foam pillows. Some have other pillows. I'm sure you know exactly what kind of pillow you have. And you probably have your favorite pillow, don't you? Well, think about the pillow of travel with Jacob. The sun has set, the sun is down. He finds some stones, and he places them for his pillow. For just a moment, I want you to think about how good we have it. Not only in travel, we can get on a boat, a plane, a train. We can get in our personal vehicles, and we can travel almost anywhere we want to go. And if the sun goes down, what happens? We even live in the age of convenience, and your headlights come on for you, don't they? But he has to take some stones and pull them up in a particular place and to lay down, verse 11, in that place to sleep. It's while he's there, verse 12, that he dreamed, and behold, a ladder sat on top of the earth, and the top of it reached to the heavens, and behold, the angels of God descending or ascending and descending. Here he sees something that's very interesting to him. It's a ladder. But this ladder goes from the earth to the heavens, and upon that ladder are the angels of God. They're ascending and descending, which signifies to you and I God's work upon the earth, and God being in control of all the earth, and God being in charge of all the earth. And God here is appearing to Jacob, and he's telling him some very pointed messages. Look at verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac, and the land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. Do you remember how this began with Isaac telling Jacob what he needed to know in verses 3 and 4 about what God would do if he would stay with God, about the land and about the seed promise that was taking place? This is all threaded through the Old Testament, and we see that taking place. And what we see inside of the Old Testament is we see God taking people of whom made mistakes and using them in their lives and in His life to continue His good. Matter of fact, verse 12 is the very first time that we read about inside of God's Word of God appearing to Jacob. Matter of fact, if you look in the book of Genesis, there are 7 occasions where God begins or appears unto Jacob. And here in Genesis 28 is the very first time. It was during a dream, and he sees this thing taking place. Abraham and Isaac had received a very similar promise in verse 14. But this is the continuation of that as we read in the New Testament of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We're seeing these things come true as they are here, seeing the very similar promise which fulfills ultimately inside of Christ. Now, I want you to see something in verse 15. I want you to see what the Lord says. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to of thee. You know, it's overwhelming to me to look in the Old Testament, and you've probably seen this as well, to see God say something to someone, and then to see God do it. To see God say something, and then to see God do it. To see God say something, and then for it to happen as God had planned it. But it's another thing entirely to be Jacob and to hear God say, this is what I'm going to do, and then wait. Now just remember about Jacob where he's at. He's in the midst of his travels. He's still in this dream. His head's still on a stone. And this is what he's learning. I will do as I've told you, the end of verse 15. All that I have done, all of that I have spoken of, I will do. And thus when you roll into verse 16, you see Jacob awaken. And it's Jacob who says that God was in this place, and he says, I knew it not. Could you imagine how his mind was before he went to sleep and after he woke up? I think verse 16 may be one of the most interesting passages outside of Genesis chapter 28. God was here and I didn't know it. We probably need to be like Jacob, and we need to recognize where God is. Jacob did, and during this dream, and when he woke up from this dream. But what about you and I? Do we recognize where God is? If you allow me to extend this thought, do you recognize where God's people are and where they're supposed to be? And do you recognize where you are and where you're supposed to be? He came to this place and he did not expect any of this, but he found that God was in this place and he never knew it. You see, in verse 17, you see Jacob and God. Jacob uses 2 words here in verse 17. He uses the word afraid and he uses the word dreadful. Now, if we use the word afraid, I am afraid, I think we know what we would be saying, don't we? I am scared of something. I am trembling of something. If we use the word dreadful, dread, that means we're not looking for whatever is coming and we're not anticipating, we're not ready for it. But that's not these words here in verse 17. The word afraid is a word that means to revere and to give reverence. Jacob stands in respect of who God is. It's in verse 17 of which we read the word dreadful. And this word, it signifies to us that he has had an awesome experience. We have dumbed down the word awesome. We say that car is awesome. This and this and that and this and that is awesome. And we bring it down to a human level, but we bring it down to, if you'll allow me to say it this way, a petty level. We bring it down to the physical, the purely physical. But when Jacob was there, he stood in awe of one. And it was God, verse 17. And he was afraid. He was left in respect and said, how dreadful, how awesome is this place? There's none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. He saw the dream. He saw the ascending and the descending of the angels of God. So it's inside of this we learn about Jacob's confidence. So as he rises up early inside of verse 18, he took the stone of which he had for his pillows, the stones, and he set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. I don't think Jacob wanted to forget this moment, do you? And I believe this pillar that's being left here, which he has poured oil on top of, tells us that he's probably going to come back by this place, and he wants to remember what he's going to do or what has happened here. You see, Jacob had confidence when he was in this particular scene, and Jacob was so confident and so impressed by what happened inside of verse 19, he called that place Bethel, but the name of it was called Luz at the first. The word Bethel is the word that means house of God. And it's interesting where he had this dream, he calls the place Bethel where he leaves the stone, and he's never going to forget this place because it was the place of which God came to him in a dream, the first of these times that would take place for him. So thus he makes a vow unto God, verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow saying, if God be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, I will and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. Do you remember what his father told him? If you stay with God, verses 3 and 4, all will be well. If you summarize what God has told him in these previous verses in this dream, if you stay with me, all will be well. I believe what Jacob is saying here is not that if God does this, then I will stay with him. But God's going to do these things, and I will stay with him. I love the idea of this, that he says that God will keep me in the way that I go. You know, you and I know the way that we should go. And we should, as Jacob has done, declare unto ourselves, no one is there but Jacob. No one goes on his journey with him. His father didn't send someone with him. His father did not send someone to do this for him. To find a wife, remember verses 1 through 5 of why he's gone. But you and I, in the privacy of our own time, as individuals, need to make sure we know who we're going to stay with. Will you stay with God? Jacob was going to. Now, Jacob was not going to be perfect. Jacob was not going to be perfect. From this time on, Jacob's not going to be perfect. From the time we look at in the past, Jacob was not perfect. Isaac and Rebekah were not perfect. Esau was not perfect. But Jacob was learning a lesson as he traveled in this day, that he needed to stay with God. And thus he was given and set up this great reminder. And this stone, verse 22, which I have set for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. He's given this great reminder of what God has done and what he can do as he continues to travel in this tall dream of this ladder that reached all the way to the heavens has taken place. In the next place, you see Jacob, who is involved in a love story. Remember how this started. Let's send him to find a wife. Now, that's odd to you and me, because I don't know a mother and father who has sent their son off to find a wife. Do you? It may have happened in your lifetime, but that's a very rare occurrence in the day of which we live now. Matter of fact, I know no one of which is thinking about marriage has been sent by his parents to go find a wife. Which, by the way, should tell you and me something about love, shouldn't it? It should tell us that love has to be developed. Love has to be developed. And you'll see this in this account as it continues on in what we're going to see in this occasion. You see him in chapter 29, picking up in this. He's doing as he is told. He's following this journey. And in verses 1 through 3, the chapter is being introduced. This is what's going to take place. And here's what he's found. And he's found these sheep, and he's found a well. And a lot's going to take place at this well, of which has been covered up with the sheep around it, verses 1 through 3. A lot's going to be there. And it's really a great introduction to the chapter as we see what's taking place. You look inside of verses 4 through 6, and you think about these words. All of a sudden, here is this woman. Here is Rachel. Verse 4, and Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence have ye be? And they said, Of Haran are we. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. It just so happens that he's doing as his father has told him. He has just heard, or in a dream heard from the Lord, about staying with God and following God. What was he there for? Remember verses 1 through 5 of chapter 28? To find a wife. And behold, Rachel cometh with the sheep. It's interesting, at least to me, as I look at this particular occasion, that you see Rachel tending to the sheep. I think that might have been interesting, at least to some as well. But it was Jacob inside of verses 7 and 8 who kind of shows himself off a little bit. This seems to be something that's just true through the ages. Man meets woman, man must show woman he is strong. And for whatever reason, that seems to be the case taking place here with Jacob. He says in verse 7, Lo, it is yet high day, neither is it the time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go feed them. And they said, We cannot until all the flocks be gathered together, till they roll the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. He starts asking these questions. Well, why aren't you doing this? And why aren't you doing that? And why are you not watering the sheep and feeding them? It seems to be the continuation of that conversation that was taking place as Rachel was appearing. Remember before? He was talking to this man. Do you know him? He is well. How is he? And all of these questions get answered. This is the continuation of that particular question. Verse 9, in comes Rachel, and you see the boy who meets the girl. Verse 9, and while he spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. It seems before, just a moment ago, he could see her. And now she is near with them. She has brought the sheep. She's brought them to the well, and guess who's there? Well, Jacob is there. And look at verse 10. It came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Jacob meets Rachel. Jacob begins to impress Rachel. Remember, he rolls this stone. The other men would not do it. It was not time, they said. So he rolls the stone by himself, it seems. The text indicates. And you learn something about Jacob. It's verse 11. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Why did Jacob go here the whole time? Why was Jacob here? To find a wife. And they told him where to go to find the wife. They told him the city of which to go and the man of which to talk to. And guess what he's found? He's found the place he needed to be. He's found the people of which he needs to be. And lo and behold, here is Rachel, of which he is after to find. And Jacob here, he weeps. You roll into verse 12. I want you to see this. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now, news did not travel as fast as it travels today in the time we're reading about. Matter of fact, Jacob left on his journey, and he arrived at his journey. There was no time for someone else to go tell them he was coming. And as soon as she finds out who he is, she runs off and tells her father who he was. And some people would say the rest is history, but there's a lot happening in the rest of this. Verse 13, it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house, and he told Laban all these things. You know, I don't know about Jacob, but as you think about what happens to Jacob, you wonder what's going on in the mind of Laban. See, the history we're looking at in Genesis 28 and 29 is not just about Jacob. It's not just Rachel. It's not Isaac and Rebekah. It's also Laban and his two daughters that are going to be introduced in this chapter. And it's Laban who has welcomed this man in. There's this great connection that's taken place, and this love story begins to form, but it's Laban who kind of keeps some secrets as he goes along, and this is kind of the beginning of them here. And it's Jacob's long labors. Inside of this chapter, Laban knows that since he's family, since he's kin, he can't just make him work for free. So he asked him what the price was, verse 15. In verses 16 and 17, he gives this price. And Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder, the oldest, was Leah. And the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah was tender-eyed, and Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. It's interesting to me that Laban asked Jacob, what is your wage? And where does Jacob's mind go? Where does the text bring us to Jacob's mind? To Rachel, doesn't it? But we get introduced to a fact that's going to come up to you and I in just a moment. We are introduced to Leah. Now, she's the eldest, she's the oldest, but that's not going to mean anything to us right now. And Laban's not going to tell us anything about that right now. And Laban's not going to tell Jacob any of that right now. But boy, it's going to mean something here in just a moment. Jacob knew the price. And in verse 18, Jacob speaks up. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy youngest daughter. What's your price? Well, Jacob knew the price, and we get introduced to the two sisters, and he tells him 7 years is the price. Now, if all went well, and it didn't, after 7 years, Jacob would marry Rachel. But you know what happens, don't you? You know what's going to take place, because in verse 21, it's time for payment to be due. 7 years are over. Now I want you to read with me 21. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her. He says, payment's due. You have this wedding feast. You have this wedding feast, verse 21, or verse 22. Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Did you know what Laban didn't mention yet? You know what Laban did not mention yet? He didn't mention Leah. He still hasn't. The wedding has taken place, the feast has begun, and the night is drawing near. Now, you and I know something about weddings. They're usually accompanied with a feast. You and I know other things about weddings. We understand what a marriage is. We understand what accompanies marriage. We understand what happens after marriage. And thus verse 23 takes place. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. Now, I'm not going to explain verse 23 to you, but you know what that means. Now look at verse 24 and verse 25. And Laban gave his daughter Zilpah, his maid, for a handmaid. And it came to pass, verse 25, that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob asked this question to Laban, what have you done? Now, I'll go ahead and tell you. I find this to be a difficult passage. And I think you can understand why. It wasn't Rachel. You go back just a few verses. I know we're really going back 7 years here. But Jacob knew what Rachel looked like because he says in verse 18, we learned about him that he loved her, and I'll serve 7 years for her. We know he knows what she looked like. Verse 17, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. What have you done to me? Is what he wants to know of Laban. What is this that thou hast done unto me? Did I not serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore hast thou beguiled me? Why did you trick me? And now Laban shows himself. We're learning something here. We've done everything we've looked at tonight to get to verse 26. I know it was a long journey, but hang with me. It'll make sense in a moment. And Laban said, it must not be done so in our country to give the youngest before the firstborn. Well, this is why I did it. Now pause with me for just a minute. Why didn't he mention that before? Why did he not mention that in the 7 years that he was going to have him serve for Rachel? Why did he not mention that at the beginning of the wedding and the wedding feast? Why did he mention it the next day? I can't answer that why, and you can't either. But Jacob wanted to know. And Jacob really didn't get a satisfactory answer, did he? That's not the way it's to be done in my country. And he says, fulfill her this week, and you will serve me 7 other years. You know, verse 26, Jacob had bad eyesight. He knew who I don't want to read into the text, but how did he not know who she was? Verse 27, he has his good eyesight back. I'll do 7 more years for Rachel. It's said of him that those 7 years were just like days. And it wasn't long till he was there. Here's where he finds himself. Because of the actions of another, he finds himself in verse 20, or himself in verse 28 and 29 with 2 wives and 2 maids. Now that's math that doesn't add up, does it? A lot of people write about this particular chapter and ask this question, did God approve of the second marriage? Because we know in the book of Genesis, as man is created, as man is brought to life, that it's one man, one woman for life. But just because God does not, inside of the text, denounce this particular thing, does that mean God agreed with it? It doesn't. We know what God thought about marriage. We know that in the New Testament, Jesus refers the people who ask questions about marriage in Matthew chapter 19 with this phrase, have you not read that he which from the beginning? No, we don't see the condemnation of this in the text, but we do see it taking place. And at the actions of another man now makes some bad choices. But I want you to read something with me. And this is the tragedy of this particular account. It's verse 30. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah. and served with him yet 7 other years. I want to give you a few lessons of which we can learn from this, and time is not on our side, so I'm going to give you 2. I had 10. I'll give you 2. Number 1, charge your children to marry someone who will help them get to heaven. That's how all this started, wasn't it? Send him away so he can find a wife. And not of the worldly sort, not of the Canaanites, but send him to find him a wife. I know our young people are not thinking right now, great, he's talking about us. That's probably what you're thinking. But we really need to instill that value. Because the truth is, marriage is one man, one woman for life. The truth is, the person we marry will either help us go to heaven, or they will hinder us in going to heaven, or they will help us go somewhere else. And we need to charge our children of which to do such. We also need to learn inside of this that we need to fulfill our days and our commitments. He said, I'll serve 7 years, so how long should he have served? 7 years. Now, he's going to serve 14 years, but this is the point. Know what you're saying, know when you're saying it, and fulfill your commitment. The truth is, he did not have to marry Rachel, but he did. That tells you and I something. You're not forced to marry anybody, but we do. Many times we do as Jacob did. Love at first sight, we might call it. And that's what we focus after in life. But what you see inside of this is God who instructs Jacob to stay with him. Jacob's parents of which instruct him to stay with God. And you see Jacob saying, if God will do these things, I will be with him. If you follow out the rest of the life of Jacob, you'll see a man who turns himself to God. And that's where you and I find ourselves tonight, with a decision that needs to be made. Maybe you need to turn yourself to God tonight. That's a choice you're going to have to make. I can't do that for you. You can't do that for me. The majority of the people in this room tonight, and as usual is on Sunday nights, is usually people who are Christians and people who have brought their children. Maybe you need to become a Christian tonight. Is anybody going to stop you from committing to the Lord? I think the best thing we learn about Jacob is he dedicated himself to staying with the Lord, even though we learn about his life, he's not always perfect. But you can do that tonight by obeying what the New Testament says. No, you're never going to be the person who that promise was given to Jacob, but you sure are the beneficiary of that promise, which brought about Christ, which brought about the church, which brings about heaven. If you need to become a Christian tonight, here's something we know: water's ready. Maybe tonight as a Christian you need to make your life right with the Lord. That's something you and you only know. Maybe others know it, but it's definitely something that you know. And that's a decision that you and I need to take seriously. Sometimes I believe we get caught up in the monotony of the Lord's invitation. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because sometimes we just see this as the time in which the service is almost over. But that's not this time, is it? This is the time of which we can respond to the Lord in the presence of His people. And it's a time of which the angels in heaven could rejoice if we give them a reason to. I know we do it every Sunday morning and every Sunday night and even on Wednesday nights. I know that's 3 times a week. But maybe it's you tonight. Maybe you need to come to the Lord and be baptized. What an opportunity is before us. Maybe you need to come back to the Lord as His child. What an opportunity is before all of us to do that. You know, life is not perfect. There's always people out there who are changing things in our lives, and it's up to us to make decisions and appropriate decisions to do that. Dennis has picked out a good song. Let's sing that song, and let's respond accordingly.